We're in Ashtanga Yoga. And in Ashtanga Yoga, what it said was that the breath helps to control the mind. But the control of the mind can happen in two ways. It can happen through manolaya or manonasha. Manolaya is when the mind is subdued for a certain amount of time, and then when it comes back the same way. The same way it comes back. So it's subdued for some time. When we do such relaxing practices, subdued, and it comes back the same way. But in manonasha, which is translated as destruction of mind, when it goes into nasha, it comes back, but not in the same way. Why not in the same way? Because that mind now is seen to be false. It's no longer a real entity. So either we see the mind false as false, or either we see the mind as consciousness. And because that mind is false, or the mind is seen as consciousness, then that mind is not troubling anymore, because the mind knows that its existence is false and the whole world is also false. So it's not running around here and there after the world. It doesn't have such likes and dislikes, such strong desires, such fancies in the world, because it's false. So therefore, it doesn't get bound, unlike our regular minds. And it is like a burnt rope. So the form of the mind, it may still be there, because the body is still there, the mind, the intellect will still be there even after the realization of the self, but it's not the same mind as before. It lost its mindness. So that is called mano nasha. We know now that the mind is false. So it never comes back the same way. And for that person whose mind has gone through mano nasha, what happens? Nashta manasaha, the one whose mind has been destroyed, becomes an utkrishta yogi. There's a nikrishta yogi and an utkrishta yogi. Utkrishta yogi means exalted yogi. And Nikrishta means who's not exalted. Why is the Utkrishta exalted? Because they have gone through Manonasha. The Nikrishta, or the lower type of yogi, has just gone through Manolaya. Because that yogi has gone through Manonasha and it's become Utkrishta, Kim Krityamasti, is there anything else to be done? No. They abide yataha swastitim. That yogi just abides in the self. So anything that that yogi does isn't really because they want something from the world. It's not coming out of this seed of ignorance and discontent. It is just an expression of their fullness. And so last time you saw how they work from joy or out of joy and not for joy. And we saw the differences between the two. Correct? Right? So the one who works for joy, what happens is they take the world to be very real. They take the world to be very real, and they run after the world, panting, panting. And no matter how much they do, it's never enough. They get something, but it's not enough. They want something else, and they want something else, and they want something else. For the one who works from joy, sees the world as false, or as that pure Brahman alone. So they don't run towards the world. In fact, the world runs after them, because they're such an exalted yogi. So the world runs after them. And so there is no wanting to run here and run there in a hope of getting something. They're already full, so they're quite relaxed. If it happens, okay. If it doesn't happen, it's not a big deal. So there's a stark difference between the two. One will be always tensed and frustrated and trying to complete themselves. The other one will be quite relaxed without any such want. Now, what happens? What is the culmination of this Ashtanga Yoga? So we've seen how one goes through all the stages. What is this culmination of Ashtanga Yoga? So in verse number 16, we see what is called the vision of reality, right? So I will chant and then you can repeat. Drishyavaritam chittamatmanaha Chitvadarshanam, Tattvadarshanam. We'll chant together. Drishyavaritam chittamatmanaha Chitvadarshanam, Tattvadarshanam. So here, first we will take the last word, Tattva Darshanam. Tattva Darshanam means vision, Darshanam, vision, Tattva of reality. Then we go to the next, Chitva Darshanam. Darshana again, vision of consciousness. Chitva means of consciousness. Then in the first line, Drishya Varitam Chittam. Chittam here means mind. Drishya, objects. Varitam, that mind without objects. Atmanha, the mind without its own objects. When that mind, it sees consciousness, that is the vision of reality. So what do we mean here? First, we look at this word, vision of reality, Tattva Darshana. When we talk about vision of reality, is it a vision outside of us? Is it something that we see? Is it, I had a vision of God outside? Is that a vision of reality? I had a vision of a being, of some sounds, of white light. Is that a vision of reality? So, to clearly define it, Bhagavan Ramana Maharishi says, what is Tattva Darshanam? What is a vision of reality? Vision of consciousness. So vision of reality equals vision of consciousness, Chitva Darshana. Now, when we talk about vision of consciousness, is vision of consciousness seeing something else as consciousness? Do I have to sit down and try to experience consciousness? Vision of consciousness means vision of myself as consciousness. So it's not that I'm trying to sit down and experience something here, because if I try to experience consciousness, consciousness will become inert. I will become conscious. Consciousness will become inert. So it's not that I'm trying to sit down and experience this consciousness per se. What is this consciousness? It is the vision of myself as consciousness. Now, how do we get the vision of oneself as consciousness? So the method is given here. When the objects are withdrawn from the mind, drishya varitam manaha. When this happens, then atmanaha, in oneself, one gets that consciousness. What do you mean? First, let's look at what is the mind. Okay, so we will take step by step so that we can see what this process is. When we think of mind, mind is nothing but a flow of thoughts. So flowing thoughts make a mind. Now, what is a thought? A thought is nothing but consciousness plus an object equals thought. This is what Gurudev has said very beautifully. So you take consciousness and you take an object like a book. Consciousness is here, book is here, and so therefore you have book thought. You take consciousness plus a bottle, and you have bottle thought. You take consciousness plus computer, and you have computer thought. So whenever there's consciousness and there's an object, there's what we call thought. And these thoughts become many. There are many thoughts. We have one thought after another thought, after another thought, after another thought. And that flow of thoughts is called mind. So it's a flow of all of these thoughts. And what's interesting is that these thoughts, they change. So first it is computer thought, then book thought, and then bottle thought, and then some other thought, and they keep changing and they keep changing and they keep changing. So the objects change, the thoughts change, but that consciousness ever stays the same. And in this world, what normally happens is I switch from object to object to object to object to object to object, going around circles. And the mind is never freed up. And it's just got, that's why the mind gets so tired. Sometimes it's not that we're physically tired, but the mind becomes tired because it's switching from this object to that object to this object to that object. Now, what it's saying here is withdraw that mind from the object. When we withdraw the mind from the object, what we will find is the mind abides in its nature as consciousness, because the mind is actually consciousness. So if we want the mind to abide as its nature of consciousness, then all we have to do is withdraw the mind from that object. So whatever that object is, whatever it may be, instead of going outward, come back inward. So this is a book. Okay, now where is this thought coming from? What's illuminating it? How did this happen? When we go inward, then what happens is the mind becomes silent. It becomes silent and it abides in its own nature. That is called Chittvadarshana, knowing the mind as consciousness, realizing the mind as consciousness. Really realizing the mind as consciousness is called Tattvadarshana. So it's not that consciousness is only there when the mind is quiet. It's there also when the mind is noisy. But when the mind is very noisy, it becomes very difficult to abide in it. The only thing we really do is abide in our thoughts, in our changing thoughts everywhere. But when the mind becomes quiet and settles down into its nature, then it becomes very easy to abide. That is called Tattva Darshana.